Welcome to Programming User Interfaces. Today in this lecture, we're going to cover CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a way to add style to a specific HTML page. And so when I say style, I mean everything from color, font type, font size, layout, borders, margins, all those things are controlled by CSS. And so we say it's cascading because it's kind of like, flowing from a higher point to a lower point, and these rules kind of flow from the high point to low point, and they overwrite each other as they go from one place to another. And so these rules that dictate everything from color to padding are defined at the kind of lowest level at the browser default level. And so the browser default is basically just the default styles that came shipped with the browser software. So the default style in Chrome or Firefox or um, Internet Explorer Edge or something like that. So these defaults are pretty similar across browsers, but they say, okay, there should be so many pixels in padding of a list item, or a body should have X size margins by default, etc. And so these lowest level kind of styles will be then overridden if there is an external style sheet present. And so an external style sheet is basically a set of CSS rules that are imported from somewhere else, right? And then above that are the internal style sheets. So if there is a CSS style definition that's included in the head of the page, but not linked externally, then that would be take priority over it. So just kind of quickly to clarify that, if we look at this glitch site, we can see that in our HTML page, that there is the head, right, of the head element that has all the metadata and stuff. And so it has a linked out to this CSS style sheet. And so it's called style.css. So this is an external CSS style sheet. But if you had a style tag defined here inside of the head elements, this would take priority over what's linked externally, right? So if you had a style in the style sheet for body, and then you had a style in the style sheet for body in the internal style sheet, this would take priority, right? It would take more priority over the external rule. So that's the difference between the external versus internal style sheet. But what takes even more precedent over both of those together is the element style, inline style. So this is when you actually use the style attribute to kind of override any other styles and apply it specifically just to that element being defined. There's some kind of more rules around this, like there's an important tag that can override everything. That's the most important thing. But this is kind of, if you think about the flow of the rules of CSS rules, this is kind of the order that they flow in. So of course, everything in HTML and CSS, there's coheres to a box kind of model. And so everything is a box when you think about it. And all these boxes have these various attributes that make them into their right size box. So things like the things you normally think of, like height and width, and then of course padding and margins, that how far they are away from something else and how much internal white space there is. And then of course there's the border, even the thickness of the border controls how big a box is. And then the position, right? The position of the box in the page. And so if you inspect anything on the web using something like Chrome developers tools, you can see this box laid out for you and see the, down to the pixel level measurements of what's actually taking up and what's actually making this box a certain size, from its, margins and padding to just its definition, width and height. So some of these elements by default behave differently than others, depending on if they're kind of block elements or inline elements. And so, for example, the div element, right, by default, that element wants to expand to 100% of its width of the page. So it will try to take up as much width as it can across the entire page if added to the code, because that's just the way the div style is set up to work by default. As opposed to like a span element, which is displayed inline, which it will only take up the width of the content inside of it. So these different rules apply to these different elements by default. You can of course change them based on their CSS properties, but just going into it, you know that these rules are going to behave, these elements are going to behave a certain way by default unless you change them. So I think a lot of us have some basic kind of CSS experience, but you know, when you are defining a rule, you basically have to define some sort of identifier variable or identifier kind of code to say what that rule should apply to. And in this case, we have this number sign my div or dot books, and those are kind of like the rule saying what should be applied to this, what style should be applied to, and then you have the actual style definition. And you can always know this style definition is going to be inside these curly brackets when you're defining a style sheet like this, and they're going to be key value pairs. So the key is the name of the style element that you're changing, and then the value is going to be the value of the style that you want to assign it to. So in this case, the key is color, right? And then for one of them, the value is red, and then for the other one, the value is blue. So in this case, you're always going to end these rules with this semicolon punctuation at the end of them. So as I mentioned before, when you have an internal style sheet, it's just a style tag that has these rules defined within the style tag. And depending on how the other rules are defined, they'll take more precedence over other style definitions. And of course, this is when I mentioned having an inline style, this is what it would look like. So say, for example, you wanted to style there's just this one H1 element, and you wanted to make it blue, and you want to make it the text align in the center for it. You can do this inline syntax where you just say style equals blah, 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 and the CSS rules go inside. Notice there's no curly brackets, but their rule statements are still punctuated by a semicolon at the end of each rule. And so this is a way you can style individual elements, but I would say try to avoid this application of CSS because it's kind of frowned upon because it causes a lot of repetition, right? If you wanted to apply the style rule to many things, you can define it once in a CSS style sheet, but if you wanted to do it via this inline style, you'd have to apply this to each and every single element that you wanted that style to apply to. So it's much more efficient to have a rule that applies to exactly what you want rather than having to go in manually and set the style for each and individual thing. But it is a nice thing to have if you're especially just playing around with getting things laid out and designing stuff. It's always nice to kind of throw a style, inline style there just to get it to the place you think looks good and then move it over to a style rule sheet. So you can override different selectors, right? So you can, the way that the rule is applied is based on how you define it and the selectors that you define to apply to which elements. And so, for example, at a very high level, you could actually say, okay, I want all the text of a paragraph tag, the P tag, to be the color red. So the fonts would be red, right? Or you could say, I want everything in a div tag to have the text color blue, right? So you're overriding the default style for that element specifically. You can also use class names. And so classes is kind of a new concept if we haven't talked about before, but it's basically an attribute that lives in the HTML elements, right? So at the bottom there you see there's a unordered list and then there's a li tag and it says class equals first and done, right? So this li element has two classes associated with it, the class first and the class done. And so those are two classes that can be defined in your CSS name using this period notation, right? So you say period and then the class name and then the curly brackets and then the rules. And so wherever you use that class name in your class attribute in your elements, it applies that class style to that element, right? And so this is like a variable, right? So there are variable names that you're defining yourself. You know, the computer doesn't care that I call it first or done. It just cares that it has a certain unique name, and then I use that unique name all over the place. So when you're naming things like this for your classes, you probably want to make sure they make sense to you, right? So if you're reading the code later, you understand why this is, what class this is and why it's applied to this element, etc. You can also use the ID selector. So this is probably the other main way you'll apply a CSS style to something. And so by using the number sign, the octothorpe or hashtag, and then your variable name. So here we say have two IDs. We have one called polite and one called rude. And one has a font family for cursive. The other one is a monospace and makes it uppercase, right? And so in your element tag, when you're writing out the element, you'd set, instead of saying class, you'd say ID equals and then the ID name for that rule. Of course, the main difference between a class and an ID selector is that a class will apply to multiple elements. You'll have many elements that have the same class, whereas if you use an ID selector, it will only ever have one element per page, right? So only use IDs when you're styling one specific thing that is unique in the page. Otherwise, you should be using classes because there's multiple things that can have that class. So class is for many and ID is for singular. And what makes CSS very powerful is that you can combine these rules together. And so you can use a whole bunch of different combinations, and just it's how you write out the rule for selecting which elements on the page are this rule and these styles are applied to. So for example, this first one says div.test. And so what this is saying, it's going to find all the divs that have the class test and then apply that style to them. And the second one is test.span or test space span. So it's basically going to find the element on the page that has the ID test, doesn't matter what it is, and then it will look for all the span elements within that ID element test and apply that font size to it. So, this is almost like a little mini programming language. I have a link here to some more, a good document that defines a lot of these. And so I would spend some time going through these possible combinations and reviewing the examples that they give, right? And so it's useful because you kind of want to have the most kind of like elegant selectors possible because you're able to write rules that apply to just what you want and change them in a way that makes them kind of very easy to maintain, right? And so you can go through in here and see there's different kind of combine operators. So place between CSS selectors, it matches only those elements matched by the second selector and that are the direct children of the elements matched by the first, right? So this only matches P elements that are children of the article elements. So of course you can get very into the weeds and learn all of these kind of operators and way that they apply. But it does, regardless of what kind of selector you're defining, you're always going to be writing the style rules in the same way. So it's useful to kind of know what's possible with these selectors. So I would review going through the site and kind of just getting a concept of what's possible with the selectors. But it's not like you have to memorize these. Usually, once you get to a place where, like, I really wish I could select just the divs in this class thing, then you'll figure out, okay, this is how I need to structure the rule to actually get to that point to get the elements I want selected. All right, so there's also pseudo classes, and so pseudo classes are basically you kind of think of them as a state of a class or kind of like an attribute of a class. And so if you think about an A link, right, those are the usually blue HTML links that link out to a different page. So these elements usually have a color for the browser if you've already visited that page, right? So if you're on like a Google search result page and you already clicked on one of those links, it's usually a different color. It's like purple or pink or something like that. And so these pseudo classes let you define those states, that what they should be, right? So if, for your page, you want your visited color. So if someone clicks on a link and it's been visited before, you want it to be a certain color, then you can define it. And there's many pseudo classes that I would also encourage you to kind of quickly go through and just get a sense of what's possible, right? Because there are some really interesting ones that are powerful. So things around order, like what position they are in the hierarchy, and then really useful ones are things like hover, right? So when there's a mouse or a user input hover over a certain element, you can invoke a different style. So those are always very useful. So definitely check that out and see what's possible. Um, So the other major thing is when you're defining a rule or a style rule, there's going to be some value, right? So there's the key and the value has to be something. Sometimes it's a reserved keyword, right? And other times it's a color, right? Or some other sort of qualifier. And oftentimes it's a unit of measurement. And so the unit of measurement, when I say that, I mean things like pixels, I mean things like EM, and other measurement units. So one thing to think about when you're doing this though is try to avoid using pixel measurements because pixels are very different on different devices, right? So it's kind of um, tempting to get something to look very perfect on your display, and then as soon as you look at it in another display, it looks terrible, right? So using more relative measurement units like the EM units is a little bit more sustainable, right? Also, things like VW and VH are kind of relative to the size of the viewport or the size of the device. So you can use these to kind of make things scale more elegantly than trying to do responsive things. So definitely try to avoid pixels at all costs, and stick with using things like EM or more advanced units like view width and view height. And of course, percentages are always nice for layouts and stuff. So speaking of layouts, the one layout system, CSS layout system that we're going to talk to today is going to be the Flexbox layout system. And so what before CSS really provided this ability, it was always very difficult to do layouts in HTML pages. The earliest pages really relied on things like HTML tables, like to do basic like page layouts of two-column layouts and stuff like that. And so what the CSS rules allow you to do is having a much more powerful way of doing layouts and controlling layouts of your material, of your elements and your site. So there's other systems like there's one called Grid that we'll get to eventually. But today we're just going to talk about Flexbox because it's like a very kind of easy to get into and understand layout system. Um, but basically, the idea behind Flexbox is that everything is a container or an item, and when you set the kind of behavior of the containers as children, and then how the items, the children of the container, behave with each other. So I provided some links here to some tubes documents you can kind of check out. But if we look at this first one, it gives you the CSS rules that kind of define rules that control the Flex container, and then rules that control the Flex items. So like to even begin to make something fall into this Flex layout mode, you have to define that um, CSS rule to say, I want you to display using the Flex rules. Let me make this larger, right? So even to get started, you have to say, okay, I want this div to adhere to the Flex rules, and I want its children to adhere to the Flex rules, etc. So it would be good to go through these and see, kind of get the sense of what's possible, um, and what is allowed by using Flex. And so what's really the thing to keep in mind is that Flex is really for controlling the layout of a page. And it's something that you'd want to do very kind of like early on to make sure that the layout is going to be working for you. So we're going to do a little activity. And so the goal of this is to kind of get our feet wet with using Flexbox and get a sense of how it can be used to do layout of kind of simple column layouts. So what we're going to do is if you head over to this glitch and you remix it, right? So if you head to the glitch and you're going to go to remix on glitch, and it will remix your own version of this, so you can just edit it as you please. But the goal of this, if you go to the HTML page and you look at the rendering of it here, You basically have a setup where you have some divs and you have some challenges here, right? So the first one is, can you make the above item in item one and item two into two equal columns using Flexbox? Can you add another column but make it twice as large as the other, right? So if you think about doing some very basic column layouts, these are basic kind of tasks that you'd want to be able to do. Have, three columns and one big, twice as big as the others. Um, you can also do some kind of internal laying out, right? So the next one is, can you have one column and align it to the right? So kind of like a one column menu on the right hand side. And then, if you want to play around with some more layout ideas, think about maybe what layout system you'd want to have for a certain feature, and then think about what kind of flex uh, uh, code you would have to do to get that layout working. So pause the video and spend some time to see if you can figure out how to get these CSS flex rules working, and then we'll come back and do it together. Okay, so let's go through this together. We're going to try to accomplish some of these challenges that the instructions had laid out for us. So the first one was, can you make the above item one and two into an equal column? Right, so this is an item one, this is an item two. So if we look at the way that this HTML is laid out, there's a div that contains two other divs. One has a class called container, and then there's two other classes called item one and item two, right? So what we're saying, we want this to go from being a stacked thing, like a div normally would behave, to going to a two-column layout. And so what we can do is we need to initially turn on flex for the container, right? So there's always container and children. In this case, our container is this class called container. And so we just needed to say, okay, display flex, right? And we'll end with a semicolon and take a look here, and it automatically changed the way that it's laid out, right? So now the children are defined to behave under the flex rules, and they're kind of equally taking up the same amount of space in the flex container. So to make them equal, though, you just have to define on their flex shrinking row. And so if you look at the documentation here, these flex rules can be defined by just saying flex, and then you can use a value like 1 through infinity to say how big they should take up compared to their siblings. And so what we can say is just, okay, we're going to say flex is equal to 1 on the first item, and flex is equal to 1 on the second item. So if we look at it now, we'd see that the two items are set to take up equal space, right? They're 1 to 1, 1 and 1. They are half of the available space to take up. So if you said you wanted item 2 to be twice as big, you just come in here and say this should be twice as big, right? And then it would grow, flex grow, to be twice as big as the other siblings. All right, so the next one is, can you add another column but make it twice as large as the others? Okay, well, we kind of did that. So we'll say, okay, so we're going to have another item here, right? So we could add another item. This will be item 3, right? So we'll define a new item 3 rule for that class. And we'll say, we'll make this red. And let's take a look at it now that we added that, right? So they're all flexbox 1, flex 1, so they all grow to equal distribution. But if we make this a 2, right, item 3 is now twice as big as the other items. So it takes up equal amount of space as the other two items combined, right? So now it's twice as large as the others. Can you have a one column layout just aligned to the right of the page, right? So this would be kind of tricky without flex, but what we can do is go in, we're going to get rid of the other items that we added. So item 1 and 2, we'll delete them. And let's just see how it looks, right? So there's just one item now. And if we go to this documentation, we can see that there's some rules for the container about how the children should behave within it. And one of those is the justified content rule. And so this tells where the children should start, right? So where should they be in the in the container? And so that rule goes at the container level, right? Because it's applying to all the children. And we could say flex end, right? And so this is saying, okay, I want to justify the children to start at the end of the flex container. And so it doesn't really do anything yet because this is still set to be very large. So we can make this smaller, right? We can even go down to 0.25. So it would be a quarter of the size of the container. And now it's aligned to the right, right? So those were the kind of the three ones. If you can get those working, you could probably pretty much build together any kind of basic column layout you could want, right? And so you can imagine these don't have to, this doesn't have to be all encompassing for the whole page. You can have many of these flex containers down the page, one flex container for the header to do certain things, one for the main body of the page, one for the footer, one's inside the main body of the page for content, etc., right? So it's a very powerful thing to play around with and figure out how to get working for your specific layout that you want to do. Um, and if you can think it, you can usually get it working with Flex. All right. So after that activity, let's take a look at um, frameworks, right? And so one of the things that you'll find by doing the CSS, it's really great to think about CSS in terms of, from the ground up, doing it from scratch and really having control over everything. But there are some CSS frameworks, and this is kind of a new concept for us because there isn't really an HTML framework, but there are CSS frameworks, or you could call them libraries. And so what these are external style sheets that are already defined that allow you to apply their classes and get going very quickly. So if you wanted to, say, for example, use one of these existing frameworks, like Bulma, for example. Bulma is a Flexbox-based framework. And the difference is that, right now we have the basic materials to doing CSS based around, defining CSS rules and classes and IDs, and then applying those rules. When you use a framework like Bulma, for example, it already has classes defined for you. And basically, your new challenge is to learn how to do what you want to do in the CSS framework itself. So basically learning what classes you need to apply to what elements to make it behave the way that you want it to, right? And so, for example, they have the same idea of doing columns in Bulma. As we just did it in Flexbox. So if you go to the site and you would look at the documentation for that CSS framework that you want to use, and you say, okay, I want to do a column layout. So you go into here and you say, okay, let's do a basic column layout, and you would look at basically how they define the code for that to work, right? And so these are just classes being defined, and then you basically do the same definition as they're doing, and you'll have the same results as them. And so basically, to get started with this, you would have a include, right? So you would include this in your into your header. So you have this external style sheet that's being included to your page, and then all those Bulma classes would be available to you to get started. So you would go in here and you would download it. You would have a zip file that you would use to load into your page. Like you would add that CSS file to your project, and then you would include it to get started using it. So we'll talk more about frameworks in the future, but I just wanted to kind of put them out there to know that they exist, and keep in mind whether there's trade-off between doing your own CSS and doing a framework wise. So the challenge for this week is going to be continuing with our class projects. So the New York Times site, the IMDb site, or the museum site. And basically, you're going to start off doing the basic CSS for the page, right? And so this is going to be using Flexbox to get started. to do the layout, and then start adding things like styling and colors and all this stuff. So if you want to get involved in using a framework, you can totally do that if that's more your speed. If you want to just kind of focus in on writing your CSS rules from scratch, you can also just do that. It's really up to you. So by the end of this challenge, you should have some rough CSS layouts for your um, pages and for your 3 pages, and it's kind of a beginning of a CSS look or styling look for your site. So we'll come back later and we'll go over that challenge again once you have some time to attempt it. And so until then, I'll talk to you later and bye.